Okay, so welcome. Today we'll be discussing trauma with the ultimate goal of intersecting Christian faith and psychology. I'm Antonia Soji. I'm a general physician. I'm also a trauma and addictions recovery therapist. So this is the outline we'll follow. We'll discuss introduction, discuss what makes an event traumatic, because it's not all events that are traumatic for everybody. We'll discuss the various types of trauma, the common trauma responses, the impact of trauma, then post-traumatic symptom and trauma in the Bible. And of course, we come to way forward and an invitation to break patterns. So trauma is defined as an invisible force that shapes our lives. It shapes the way we live, the way we love, and the way we make sense of the world. Trauma is not what happens to you. It is what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. And summarily, I see trauma personally as anything that happens to us or to you and impacts the way you see God, you see yourself, you see others and the world. So when a lady says all men has come, that is a distorted view of seeing men in entirety. That is trauma speaking. Something has happened to such a lady to believe that now all men has come because now it has impacted the way she sees other people. If someone says, I'm not good enough, I may never do well, there's nothing I do that seems to work. Something has happened to such an individual that has impacted the way he or she sees himself or herself. So that was traumatic. Something happened along the way. Maybe something the individual is aware of or may not be aware of, but whatever it is, it happened and it changed the way he or she saw God. And when someone says, God cannot be trusted, God does not answer prayer, that again is trauma speaking. Something that's happened that it has impacted the way the person sees the benevolence and the omnipotence of God. Now, as to what makes an event traumatic, there is no rule. It is more about how individuals will react to certain traumatic events. And some factors that would affect that would be how much trauma or how much stressors they've experienced in their life or how sensitive they are. Sensitive individuals are more easily traumatized. It takes little to traumatize them. Then those who have been stressed and have experienced a lot of adverse conditions can be more easily traumatized by some conditions. But anything would be said to be traumatic if it makes an individual feel one or more of these: frightened, under threat, humiliated, rejected, abandoned, invalidated. For example, you feel that your feelings, your views have been dismissed or denied. If it makes you feel unsafe, if it makes you feel unsupported, trapped, ashamed, powerless, those are traumatic conditions. And human being is tripartite. We are made of both body, soul, and spirit. The spirit is man's hidden part, is the deepest, is the innermost part. Our spirit was created to contact, to receive, and to contain God, who is the spirit. God dwells in our spirit. The soul is man's inward part. Our soul contains the psychological realm. It composes of our mind, our emotions, our will. Our soul will think, will feel, and choose. The body is the outermost part, is the part that will contact the physical realm through our five senses of sight, of smell, of taste. Excuse me, please. So now the body is the outermost part, and our body will contact the physical realm through our five senses, sense of sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. And 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 23 says, and the God of peace himself sanctify you wholly, and may your spirit, soul, and body be preserved complete without blame at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, trauma happens at the soulish realm. And when trauma happens, how this would impact is that this Bible verse becomes a challenge in their life, because if it says, the God of peace himself will sanctify you wholly, and may your spirit, soul, and body be preserved and complete without blame at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Trauma damages the soul. I put this slide up because I would use it to explain some things later. And once it damages the soulish realm is what allows for communication between the spirit and our body. And once this is damaged, it will impact the way people see God. It will impact the way people see relationship with people, with others. It will impact how they communicate with the outside world, relationship with others, how they see others. It will even impact how they see themselves. The first of all trauma, in my own opinion, is a lack of spiritual covering. I'll still come to explain the various types of trauma later. Then, of course, followed by lack of emotional covering or support. Now, when people have kids, they house them, feed them, educate them. That will cater to two things: the physical part, which is the body; the intellectual part, which is the mind. The emotional part, which is a component of the soul, is left. Because seldomly would we parents who would sit and have emotionally laden conversation with their children are not that many. Parents who would tolerate their children's display of emotions are not that many. Parents who would guide them as to how it should be done are not that many, because they were also not well equipped. I believe that all parents love their children dearly. It is just that what they don't have, they may not be able to give. So the wounding many times will happen for most people at the level of this lack of emotional covering and support, as you will come to see later. And it permits me to say that the heart comes first, because if it is the body, the soul, and the spirit, the heart in this case now is the emotional part, not the physical heart that is seated within our body. It comes first. If not, most Bible verses that has to do with the heart and the soul would place the heart before the soul. Mark chapter 12, verse 30, for instance, says, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. When you come to God, what makes you come over and over again is oftentimes because there's a drawing, there's some emotional connection, there's some desire, there's some joy, there's some peace that you feel when you come to God. That is your heart, loving God. Then with all your soulish faculties, your understanding, your will, then of course that then helps your mind to be fruitful with all your mind. And then that allows you to pull all of the physical strength. You're able to fast. You're able to pray long hours with all your strength. Then Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 to 5 says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Heart comes first. Why is this important for someone who is a parent and is wondering, okay, I put my children through school, I provide for them, they have a roof over their head. Are you taking care of their emotions? Are they emotionally neglected? When they come crying, do you tell them, wipe your face? Don't you know you're a big girl? Big girls don't cry, big boys don't cry. When a child comes with second position, do you say, what happened to the one who came first? There's an emotional wounding right there. When a child comes and says, I was bullied in school, what do you do as a parent? Or is it such that the child would not even bother coming home because he or she knows that there's nothing there for him? There's no emotional support. There's no emotional anchor waiting there for them at home. Now, there are several types of classification of trauma. There's the big T trauma, small T trauma, there's the chronic, there's the acute traumatic episode, there's another constellation of an entity called adverse childhood experience scoring. But for the sake of this presentation, I will just stick with the big T trauma and the little T trauma. It encompasses every other classification of trauma. But why I like this is because many of the clients that I see who don't have the big T trauma and have a lot of small T trauma, because It looks small, it looks insignificant, their lives were not under threat. They tell you, no, I wasn't traumatized. But then they have all the adult manifestations of PTSD. So there must have been something that happened for them to be manifesting PTSD symptoms. So big T trauma is generally related to a life-threatening event or situation. This could be a natural disaster, someone who is in an environment where volcanic eruptions occur, where there are earthquakes. Those are natural disasters because the life is at risk. Violent crimes, like someone who is in the Boko Haram zone, victims of school shooting may not have been shot, but getting to witness that the life was at risk, or someone who was involved in a serious car accident that almost led to a loss of life. Acute psychological traumas like the death of a parent, and chronic ongoing traumas such as repeated physical, sexual abuse. Those are big T traumas. Now, those who go through this, they are not in any way confused as to whether they experienced a trauma. The gravity may be a bit uncertain to them, but when you tell them that was traumatic, nobody argues that. It's the small T trauma that may be a challenge for many people. And little T trauma is still highly distressing. It's just that it doesn't arise to the level of big T trauma in terms of danger because nobody's life is at risk. It's usually not life-threatening, and it can include any event that will cause distress, fear, helplessness. It's also called relational trauma because it has to do with some form of stressors in some relationship over a long time. A child who is being teased in school. If my child gets teased in school, I want to know, I want to put some things in order. But if it happens persistently over time, that child is experiencing fear, is experiencing helplessness, is experiencing distress. Now, imagine that a child does the whole of a 6-year secondary class with persistent teasing. That there is a traumatic experience. It will erode the child's sense of worth. So you couldn't have an adult who is manifesting symptoms of has a core belief of not being good enough, and then that then underrun the way they show up in life, the way they interact, the decisions they make. It's at the backdrop of some form of little T trauma. But if you don't point and bring it and say this was one of your trauma, they may still feel, oh, my childhood was great, nothing happened. If you were teased in school and you did not get home to tell your parent, or you told your parent and nothing was done about it, there's a lot of relational trauma going on there. The child was a victim, the parents were ill-equipped or did not see a need to stand up for their children. Then having an overly critical parent is also a little T trauma, but it's quite distressing. A child who is criticized at every single moment, who can literally not do anything right. What do you expect that child to experience? And the child will then grow up in the house for 2 decades. Unfortunately, is able to get out by early into the 3rd decade. The child throughout that period is experiencing fear, helplessness, fear because I will be criticized again. I don't know what I will do. I don't know what mommy's comment will be, what are these comments will be. There's an helplessness about them. After a while, they may just give up. Then of course it's distressing to such children. So such children could grow up to then be the ones who are either perfectionistic or never do well. So they are so perfectionistic that they criticize themselves and don't want other people to criticize them. Or they may just give up completely and say, why bother? What's the point? Then a child who lives in a high conflict family where there are fights every day, that is fighting the mommy, they are breaking bottles, they are pulling each other's ear, and the child gets to see that every day is distressing. There's fear, there's helplessness, there's an uncertainty about the child's core and essence. Then experiencing a lot of unpredictability, that will be children who cannot predict their parent. They're happy today, they're not happy tomorrow. They're good today, then tomorrow they fight again, then they move in together again. Mommy is good now, then the next minute she's shouting and screaming at everybody. There's a lot of unpredictability for such children. They could go on, especially when they happen repeatedly over a very long time. They could go up to manifest symptoms of post-traumatic disorder. Then moving a lot as a kid, children like this find it difficult to build bonds, to build relationships. That could also be children of parents who get transferred very often, or those who work far from home, who will come do 2 weeks at home, then they are gone for another 2 months, then do another 2 weeks, they're gone for another 2 months. Just when the child is building the bond with the dad or building the bond with the mom, that's when they move again. So such children are scared of relationship. They have like an ambivalent attachment with people. As children, that will be their challenge. As adults, that will be what they will struggle with. So there is a push and pull. They're not sure, do I lean into this relationship? How long would it last for? Then there's also the fear of, I don't want to put myself out there because it may not last. And having an unsupportive parent is also a little T trauma, which is problematic in its own way. Then losing a loved one or a pet. Now, the pet may not be for the African child, but for westernized children, for own pets may be a best friend. Losing a pet and having a parent who is not sensitive enough to give the child the support he or she needs could be counted as a little T trauma. Then having a parent who expects perfection because no one can really meet up to such a standard is a little T trauma. Why the little T trauma term is misleading? Because the impact of this kind of event is not in any way little. I see them come for therapy and you see the manifestations and they tell you childhood was good until you start to dig and you find that there's a lot of things under there that has gone wrong. And research has shown that repeated exposure to little T trauma can cause more emotional damage than a single big T event. Big T events, people know that something was wrong. They will many times want to seek help. They know that something grossly challenging happened. But little T was indolent, it was quiet, it was silent. They were still very young, they didn't know what was happening, but all the while their soul was being fractured in many parts. So the impact of repeated little T trauma in the childhood would manifest in adulthood as the following ways. A child who was repeatedly for a prolonged period teased by peers. As adults would have fears of rejection and social anxiety because they were teased very badly. They are scared to put themselves out there. They may not bother. And when they bother, they are so scared that they may be rejected. And parents who expect perfection would raise children who have a rational fear of making mistakes. They themselves may grow up to be perfectionistic just because of that fear of making mistakes. They would not want to delegate because they don't want someone else to mess up their work. And some may completely be NFAs. They don't even bother at all because that fear has so crippled them from even trying anything at all. Then having people close to you leave, there's that fear of abandonment. So they're always scared. So they will even latch on to relationships that is not ideal, just in order not to experience that fear of abandonment again. And those who live in high conflict family, they become conflict avoidant. They are unable to express their needs. They will just be the yes, 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 yes. They may end up being the caretakers just because they don't want to rock the boat. They've had so much boat rocked in their childhood that now as adults, if they get a chance, they will just let peace reign at a cost to their own self. So they will not express their own needs, all in the name of letting peace reign. Having an overly critical parent will lead to people shutting down the very first sign of constructive feedback. So if you have such people as staffs or as subordinates, when you correct them, the very first time you're just giving a constructive feedback, they just shut down because it triggers the old wound of being criticized severely by their parents when they are children. Then those who move a lot, they have a difficulty building and maintaining relationship because they've not been able to really build and grow close and nurture relationship. Those values, virtues were not imbibed in them because they moved a lot as children. So as adults, they would also struggle in building and maintaining relationships. Now, trauma responses. There are 4 signs of trauma responses. There is a flight response, there's a fight response, there's a freeze response, there's a fawn response. Now, as children, when something happens that we feel threatens our well-being, as children, many people did not have a chance to fight back, especially in relational contexts, like a child who was being teased. That child would have been angry. But if the child has not really built the confidence because they were not equipped from home, because it was eroded from home, the child has probably been teased, has been heavily criticized at home, such that they can't put themselves out there. So the child, the normal fight, trauma response, if it's a fight response, you feel angry. Person could be yelling, could lash out, there could be extreme tension in the body, there could be physical aggression or throwing things. That is normal. Now, flight response could be self-isolation, staying busy to avoid difficult feelings. inability to tolerate conflict, or immediately leaving situations where you feel uncomfortable. Then freeze response would be feelings, a sense of being dead, feeling physically cold or numb, forgetting to breathe, physically breathing, feeling physically and emotionally disconnected from the surrounding. The informed response could be avoiding conflict at the expense of one's own need, apologizing when you're not at fault, prioritizing other people's feelings to keep and receive their approval. Now, based on how traumatized individuals have been in childhood, the fight and the flight are the two normal, but they could become extreme. Extreme when trauma has set in, that by default, normal interactions will trigger an old wound. So they will not just give a flight response for the interaction that happened. They will give for all of the old wounds they were not able to express. Now, these are things that happen unconsciously. These individuals are not even aware they're doing it. There will be someone you just say a bad word to and gives you 10. That's a fight response in place. Because one bad word could have been, I don't like the way you spoke to me. I don't tolerate that. I respect myself. That would be more appropriate. You give it an appropriate fight response. But even here, life was not at risk. It was just a minor altercation. But you then see them fly off the handle. Something has gone wrong. Their trauma responses has been broken. The autonomic response has been broken, all at the backdrop of severe traumatic experiences. But the two I'm especially interested in because these are the ones that would oftentimes come for therapy. Those who fight response will many times will be mandated to go for therapy because they have anger issues. Flight response many times will manifest as addictions because they just want to get away from the feeling, from the disturbing emotions. It could be addiction to work. They just want to keep themselves busy at all costs to avoid difficult feelings. It could be addiction to smokes and the likes, drinks, alcohol, just to avoid those difficult feelings. So now freeze response is is the area I'm interested in, and fawn response. All of them are interesting in their own rights, but maybe because fight and flight are a bit kind of straightforward. Freeze response, they are not fighting, they are not the troublemakers, they may not necessarily even be addicted, but there's a general sense of deadness about their life. Those are the ones that are emotionally numb. They could feel physically cold or numb. Sometimes they could forget to breathe. That will be the one that will, after a long time, because they've forgotten to breathe. And if it's a pattern over a long time, they have a lot of things going on that they literally dissociate and disconnect from the body. They're all in their head. And after a while, then when they realize we haven't been breathing, they take that deep breath. And they will feel physically and emotionally disconnected from their surroundings. It almost feels like their life is happening like a movie. That could be a mother of 2 children who feels and sometimes finds it difficult to believe that how did I come to have 2 children? This is not psychosis in any way, but their life almost feels like a sham because they are doing life frozen. They're not doing life emotionally aware because at a point they had to develop some coping mechanism and freeze off emotion and just live in their head, live in the mind and remove the emotion part of it. Then fawn response, all in the name of avoiding conflicts. These ones would prioritize people's feelings, people's needs over their own. Those are the people pleasers. Those are the caretakers. Those are the people that they are almost too dependable. That's the word. They literally cannot say no. Because if you picture a 10-year-old who is about to be beaten, a 10-year-old does not have an option to fight an older person who is beating him or her, does not have a chance, may not really have a chance to run out of the house, except, but it's highly unlikely for children because those are the times when the trauma happened. May be able to freeze in time. You're there, but you just check out of your body while you receive the beating. That's why some children in some secondary school would take 10 strokes and will not shed 1 drop of tear. They are frozen. So they've developed their ingenious ability, not consciously in this case, it's an unconscious mechanism to check out of their body while their pain is being inflicted. And the fawn response could then be the people pleaser who will go and beg everybody, please come and help me beat this person that is making my life difficult. And trauma responses can be, but it's not limited to this. Stomach pain, abdominal discomfort that doesn't have any medical origin. They could feel discomfort when they are being touched because they are physical, they are emotional manifestations, their psychological manifestation, there's even intellectual manifestation. Those who are victims of physical and sexual abuse, they would oftentimes feel discomfort when they have been touched by others. Repeated headaches without any medical explanation. They could have trouble sleeping, out-of-body experiences, just dissociative experiences. Someone can travel from here to 2 or 3 towns away, and they got to that town and they did not realize so much time has passed because they had an out-of-body experience. They literally checked out of their body while they were on the trip. And if it happens repeatedly, is a trauma symptom. Some other ways this will manifest is someone who studies and sees that they go from page 1 to page 10 and they don't know how they got there. They watched the whole movie and missed out so many parts of it, and they were seated right in front of that movie. That was an out-of-body experience. It's a dissociative disorder. Then emotional manifestation of trauma could be trouble focusing, which is still some form of dissociation, fear of the surrounding, and irrational fear. Irrational fear of the dark and irrational fear of being alone, sleeping in a house alone. Those are not normal. Those are trauma symptoms. Then pulling away from friends and family. Isolation is also an hallmark of trauma. Then avoiding things that remind them of trauma. Someone who was sexually abused will probably not watch any film that has a connotation of rape or any abuse regardless, because it will trigger those old wounds. Somebody who was badly physically abused would also find it difficult to watch any movie in which there's some form of physical abuse. A child is being beaten, a child is being flogged, and the likes. Then they could also have mood swing. Their mood is almost unpredictable because things will trigger them and set them back in time past, and bring up that inner child who has been wounded in time, and then they carry the emotions that child could not express. Then they're better some other days, then they dip again. So their mood would flip like the weather. So how does trauma impact us? Is that general loss of safety? The world becomes a place where anything can happen. That is, goes back to that our definition as trauma is anything that happens to you that negatively would alter the way you see God, you see yourself, you see the world, and you see others. So loss of safety, they don't feel safe. They're hypervigilant. They just need to watch out for themselves all the time. So they cannot be settled. They're anxious. So because it has altered the way they see the world, they tell you the world is not a safe place. Anybody who makes that statement is trauma that is speaking. Then loss of danger cues, because they could be so hypervigilant while they're watching for things so much that they would even lose the danger cues. And sometimes they could dissociate that they may put themselves in dangerous situations without knowing. That would be those who pick a very, maybe someone who is not the best for them in a relationship. And those around can see that this is not someone you should pick out. But because they've lost danger cues, because by default, while they were being traumatized, danger looked like normal because that was all they knew. They will just keep perpetuating such cycles again. So how do you know what is dangerous when someone you trust hurt you in cases of relational trauma from childhood? And this is then their own normal. So they lose danger cues and they keep perpetuating and reenacting negative circumstances. Then loss of trust. This is especially true if the abuser is a family member or a close family friend. For those who have been abused in their own family of origin, generally they have trust issues, serious trust issues. Then shame is an impact of trauma. Anybody who carries any level of shame is rooted in trauma. Something must have happened that has altered the way they see themselves. So their core self has been stripped, has been eroded. And they would have huge, overwhelming, debilitating, in fact, so much to the point that they can't put themselves out there in the world. This is someone in whom that there's a lot of talent locked, but they can't put themselves out because of shame. So as a child, even getting an exercise wrong for some people can trigger shame because they know how badly they'll be criticized at home by these perfectionistic parents who expect so much. And the child may then grow into an adult who cannot bear to be wrong in the world because it is such a trigger. So they either become completely perfectionistic or they don't even bother at all because they don't want to be triggered they don't want to trigger the shame, the pain they experienced as children. Then for those who are survivors of sexual abuse, they could have loss of intimacy. They could have intimacy disorders. And it's almost like in two spectrums, or it's only almost like on a spectrum. There's a spectrum where they could then go on to become promiscuous. And there's the other end where they could be completely frozen without any form of interest in sexuality, such that even married men, married women who were victims of childhood sexual abuse, may not even be childhood sexual abuse, could have been raped. They could have marital relationship where nothing gets consummated. If it gets consummated, it could be a sexless relationship for years. That there is trauma. And the interest of that individual will be to dig to the root. What happened? How did this damage me? How can I begin the process of recovery? Then dissociation, often in a bid to cope with what is happening in the body during the abuse, the child will dissociate. And some of these will manifest as attention deficit, like hyperactivity disorder. So those children who are restless, who cannot sit still, who would always zone out in class. Sometimes it's not that they are being naughty, it's that a lot has happened in that child at home. That was the way the child could cope, by checking out of the body. But eventually this now becomes a pattern. It's automatic. While the child was doing it, was also the brain's ingenious mechanism. It wasn't like the child did it intentionally. But when this happens repeatedly, it becomes a pattern that even without them wanting to, they find it difficult to cope, to focus, to be present. And they grow into an adult again who would also not be able to focus and be present. You're talking with them and they ask you, what did you last say? I didn't hear you. I forgot what you were saying. And they are right there with you, not doing anything. They're not fidgeting with their phone. They're looking at you eyeball to eyeball, but they still cannot follow a prolonged train of conversation. Okay, so there's also loss of physical connection to the body. So survivors of sexual and physical abuse would often have time, they find it difficult to be in their body, because let's face it, being sexually abused, whether as a child or as an adult, rape, whatever it is excruciatingly painful. The only way they could survive that period was to check out of their body, in this case, unconsciously. Is the brain's ingenious work. Someone who is repeatedly physically abused again would also do that. So they find it difficult to be in their body because it's a very painful place. Eventually, this will become an abnormality. Okay, then loss of sense of self. Again, I said trauma is anything that happens to you that affects the way you see God, yourself, the world, and others. So once someone's sense of self is not intact, is not solid, is not strong, many times it's because they've been traumatized. Then loss of self-worth. Trauma survivors, especially survivors of sexual abuse, they can swing between feeling special to feeling dirty, feeling bad. So reenactment is when people unconsciously, they would unconsciously want to reenact their childhood dynamic. They can enter a relationship that it's bad for them, but because unconsciously they're hoping that the story can change this time around. It will not end the way my parents' own ended. I will not be victimized the way I was victimized in childhood. But now, this strategy is doomed to fail because the need is in the past. The wounded child is in the past, even though the adult that is doing it that is unconscious. More so, they're also setting the other person for failure, because the other shoe will drop, like it or not. And when it drops, they'll say, finally, I told you men has come. Or they say, finally, I said the world is not a safe place. I said, finally, marriages don't work because your parents' marriage did not work. Or finally, okay, this is how men will treat women, or women will treat men. Because it happens sometimes in your childhood days, an inner child who is wounded, who is crying, that needs to be fixed with a trauma therapy. But reenacting unconsciously doesn't help the dynamic. It will just keep perpetuating and confirming that negative belief that they hold. So symptoms of PTSD is generally categorized into four. There's the intrusive symptoms. There's avoidance, negative changes in thinking, mood, changes in physical and emotional reaction. So intrusive memories would include recurrent unwanted distressing memories of the traumatic events. That would be like flashbacks. And they could relive it as if it's happening again. So they will have all of the bodily symptoms. And some of them could literally even have a panic attack because they had a flashback of a traumatic occurrence. Then they could have upsetting dream or nightmares about the traumatic event. So they could have persistent nightmare of a particular event that has to do with the traumatic events that happened to them. Then severe emotional distress or physical reaction to something that reminds them of the traumatic event. That could be someone who was a victim of physical abuse with a particular type of cow tail called the cow whip, horse whip as a child, and then sees that horse whip in the market and begins to have palpitations, sweating, tremors, or someone who was badly beaten under a particular tree, flower tree, as a child and sees the flower tree as an adult and has a panic attack. So they could have severe emotional, physical reaction to something that reminds them of that traumatic event. Then avoidance. You'll try to avoid thinking or talking about the traumatic event. And someone who was a victim, who was maybe a military person in the Boko Haram camp and experienced a very traumatic event, they would want to avoid talking about that at all costs, except maybe therapy warrants that they should. But even then, because it brings up so much pain, they could still be beating around the bush, not wanting to eat the nail on the head. Then they could avoid places, activities, or people that remind them of the traumatic events, and they could have negative changes in their thinking and their mood. And some symptoms of negative changes in thinking and mood will include negative thoughts about themselves, other people, or the world, a general hopelessness about the future. They could have memory problem and not remembering important aspects of the events. They could have difficulty maintaining close relationships because of their negative thought patterns. They already would would already negatively prime people in their own mind. They could feel detached from family and friends. They have a general lack of interest in activities that they once enjoyed, and they could feel emotionally numb. And it's difficult for them to even experience positive emotions, such that joy feels very strange. Happiness feels very strange. You surprise them in a big way. It's difficult for them to be all excited because their default and what they've always known was negative. So it's a challenge for them to show up, be happy, be joyous, be excited. Then they could also have changes in physical and emotional reactions. They will be easily startled. They're always on guard for danger. And some could have self-destructive behavior like drinking too much, driving too fast. They could have trouble sleeping. They could have trouble concentrating. Some of them could be irritable. They could have an overwhelming guilt or shame. Now, trauma in the Bible, there are a lot of people who were traumatized in the Bible. In my own opinion, most families in the Bible were grossly dysfunctional to begin with, and so many people experienced trauma. But would examine just this handful of people and come to a conclusion. Jacob, if you go from the book of Genesis, chapter 25 to 49, even his name was Jacob, which means supplanter, someone who willfully and intentionally takes another person's place. That, for me, is trauma going there. Because why would you have a child and you name a child such a name? Now, I was also raised by a manipulative mother. If you remember where um, Isaac was supposed to bless the children, the two boys, and Rebecca was telling him to wear the animal skin and go and say that you are Esau. And Jacob was saying, what if my father knows that I'm not the one, and he would then place a curse on me rather than bless me? And Rebecca was like, let the curse be on me. As far as I'm concerned, that is manipulation. Now, this was a grown man. This wasn't a young boy. For a woman to successfully manipulate a grown man, it shows that manipulation has been happening much, much earlier. So this was a picture of a dysfunctionality here. This was a mommy's boy. He grew up in a dysfunctional family. The parents played favorites. They pitted their sons against each other. Then after he had stolen his brother's blessing, he was wanted by his own twin brother to be killed. And he gave 14 years of his life for a woman, in this case, Rachel. He had a deceptive, narcissistic father-in-law, Laban. Would you call this trauma? Because if this were to happen in our day, that was the hallmark of trauma. Manipulation, you were given a very bad name that you are called and you get teased in school with all of the dysfunctionality in the family, and to still waste 14 solid years waiting to get a woman with a father-in-law like Laban. But this same Jacob Eventually, he recognized that there was problem because in Genesis chapter 32, he came back to apologize to Esau long after their parents had died. And he didn't play the blame game. He could have said, okay, it was my mother that manipulated me, it was this, it was that, it was Laban that did that, and so many other things. He came back, made amends, and broke a pattern. And the pattern he broke was a pattern of separation, which started with Abraham. Abraham had to send Ishmael away. Then by the time he came to Isaac, they had to send Jacob away. Eventually, by the time he came to Jacob, even though Joseph was sent away, the family was still reunited because Jacob was willing to do what it took to undo all of his trauma. So then I don't know what your trauma is. Maybe it's worse than Jacob's own. But if Jacob was able to fix this and his name was changed to Israel, that is still in existence today, is an encouragement to anybody that all that has happened to us is written on the pages of the Bible. And God has in mind that every traumatized individual would ultimately find healing through their faith, through therapy, because therapy is an approach, faith is an approach, prayer is an approach, and if there's a need for medication, is all an approach. Now, David was the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse. He was a farmer and a sheep breeder of the tribe of Judah. And interestingly, you will find that when he was supposed to be anointed king, he wasn't even invited, and he was the last born. And this Bible passage, then Samuel said to Jesse, all your sons here, and he said, there remains yet the youngest. But behold, he's keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. How do you forget the last born? That's my area of interest, because if it was the last born and he was rearing sheep, how come it's the last born that is rearing sheep? You know the way last borns are in your house. They don't even wash plates, let alone rear sheep. But what I sense here is David's challenge started from his own childhood. For those who would, for Bible historians, they mix up there are a lot of stories as to confusions in David's childbirth. For those who are interested, may want to go and check it out. But what I see here is an abnormality that is already in place. So it was the last one that was rearing cattle. Last one should not be the one doing that. Generally, in families where you have a lot of older ones. And he wasn't liked by his brother, because even when he went down to give them food while they were in that battle where Goliath was killed, 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 26 says, David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God? And they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. Now, Eliab, David's elder brother, heard him speaking with the men, and he burned with anger and asked him, why have you come here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are, how wicked your heart is, and you came down only to watch the battle. Now, what have I done? And so on and so forth. Eliab is the older brother. The expected response could be, oh, dear brother, could this be risky? And if he felt that David was up to, oh, go brother, I'm proud of you. But this was spite speaking. This was hatred speaking. So this wasn't someone that was clearly liked in his own family of origin, which was why he was forgotten on his own day of anointing in the first place. Because the parents, oh, we have one more in the forest. He's keeping sheep. Now, upon being anointed to be king, he was hunted by Saul, hunted to be killed, which is why he wrote in Psalm 31, verse 14 to 15, says, but I am trusting you, O Lord, saying, you are my God, my future is in your hand. Rescue me from those who hunt me down relentlessly. He was a fugitive for decades. For nearly 7 years, David fled from Saul's murderous pursuits as he traveled from city to city, and sometimes he even hid in caves in the wilderness. You can find that from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 19 to chapter 31. Now, David carried his trauma forward with the rape of Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. And of course, this would then have a ripple effect of incest, treason, sexual perversion in his son, Ammon, Absalom, Solomon. They were all sexually perverted. The first two died from consequences of sexual perversion. This goes to show that trauma can be multi-generational. It started with David and he passed it down. But this same David was said to be the man after God's own heart. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. And he made amends and healed beyond his own trauma. Because by the time he had raped Bathsheba and killed Uriah, God sent Nathan to him. And after Nathan told him all he did, he put on sackcloth with the intention of repenting. And of course, when the boy later died, he worshipped, ate, and moved past his trauma. You can only worship when you have moved past your trauma. But what's the point I'm trying to make here again? We can see on the pages of the scriptures how traumatic David's story was, from his family of origin to when he was in line to be king, and all the other things that he went through. Imagine that you're being chased for 7 years in the wilderness. In the wilderness is in the bush, hiding in caves. But he grew past the trauma, meaning you also can. Whatever you need to do to get past it, it is possible, it is doable, and you can choose to break the pattern of trauma. And Jesus was called the son of David. You think if David had not gone past his trauma, Jesus would have been called the son of David? I don't think so. Because in Luke chapter 18, verse 38 to 41, and he cried out, there was that blind man saying, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Then those who went before him warned him that he should be quiet, but he cried all the more, son of David, have mercy on me, and so on and so forth. Jesus was called the son of David because David grew out of his trauma. You can, regardless of how bad it is. Hidden within everybody is a raw material to get out of trauma. It just will take some work. Therapy is one of such, counseling is one of such, increasing your faith in God is one of such. But whatever you have to do, please aim to get past the trauma. Job was a righteous man. He was God-fearing, but he lost all his property, his children, and he suffered great agony. All of this happened in one day. And in the midst of his suffering, Job was visited by 3 friends. And these friends, instead of comforting him, they accused him of transgression. And his wife was equally unsympathetic, more like a thorn in his own flesh. But John, despite all that he went through, you may want to read through the book of John to see what this man went through. Picture if Job was a man in our days going through all of those things. You can only imagine what the neighbors will say. And the shame, the pain, the agony, the discomfort, the distress. But in spite of all, Job had mindful acceptance. Because Job chapter 1 verse 2 says, in all of this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. It was the same person who said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will return. May the name of the Lord be praised. So he went through the valley of trauma and came out. You also can. Because by the time it will come out in Job chapter 42, verse 10, the last chapter, it says, and the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. And indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. You can only pray truly when you've gone past the trauma. You can pray your way out of trauma, but it will be that you're willing to come out of it. You can. It is possible. Job's life, again, is also a pointer to the fact that it is possible. So what's the way forward for someone who has been traumatized and is saying, so what are you trying to tell me from this? The first thing is to recognize, okay, if I have some of these manifestation of trauma imprint as an adult, it means some things probably happened in my childhood. So that recognition will, of course, then lead to self-examination. So what could have happened? How much of my childhood do I remember? Do I remember everything? What are some things that I swept under the carpet that I felt is not a big deal? That's how they raise children in my family. Because it's when you know the truth of what happened and how it impacted your view of God, your view of yourself. How do you see God? I'm not good enough. I can't make it. I'm a bad person. I'm a womanizer. So many other labels that people give themselves. How it has impacted your view of God, yourself, people, and the world in general. That we can begin our journey to freedom. John chapter 8 verse 32 says, and you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Therapy is an approach. While salvation is free and immediate, recovery is a process. For anybody who has been traumatized, who has had those wounds in their soul, recovery is a process and requires hard work. Therapy is one of such process. And Job chapter 18 verse 17 says, though your beginning was small, yet your later end would increase abundantly. Regardless of how badly you've been traumatized, it be sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, you just name it. All the barrage of all that could have happened. That was a small beginning. The later end can increase abundantly if we're willing to do the hard work of recovery and go through the process. Because still 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17 says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, is a new creature. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. If you are in Christ, you are a new creature. You can bring the trauma and ask God to rewrite it. While you do the therapy, and if you need medication and all the barrage of what it takes to be in whole, please do what you can to get better. Invite God into the trauma, into the story, into your life. And because sometimes again, trauma can give us an illusion that we've been separated from God. Romans chapter 8, verse 32 to 39 says, for I'm persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor heights, nor depths, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus. Your trauma cannot separate you from the love of God. That's why I said for those who are in Christ, they are a new creature. Old things are passed away. Nothing can separate you from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus. Because this same manner of love was bestowed on us that we should be called children of God. So with your trauma, you are still a child of God. And Christ, Romans chapter 5, verse 6 to 8 says, Christ died for us while we were yet sinners. If you want to study this Bible passage. So while the trauma was still there, while you were the one traumatizing people, because some victims of childhood sexual abuse have also gone on to also abuse some other people. Christ died for you. Christ loved you. So he's inviting you to more. He's inviting you to come forward, to come out of that cycle of trauma. So in conclusion, this presentation is just to bring an awareness to trauma, to see that trauma is also hidden in the pages of the Bible, and those same traumatized individuals eventually came out of it by being intentional, by latching on to God. Some of them probably have had some counseling, some would have spoken to themselves, but most trauma would really need therapy, need counseling. So this is an invitation to healing and to break patterns, because trauma could be multi-generational. If it started with your parents, then they had their own issue, then they passed it on to you. If you're not intentional, you would also pass it on to your children. So you can start from where you are and break the pattern. So why it did not start with you? Trauma did not start with you, trust me. It didn't start with your parents. It started much earlier than that, but it can stop with you. God can heal. Therapy is an approach. Medication is an approach, regardless of your past, regardless of what has happened, how traumatizing your background has been. Your future is spotless. Here is an invitation to that spotless future. Isaiah chapter 46, verse 10 says, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times. What is still to come, I say. My purpose will stand. God's purpose for your life will stand, and he will do all that he pleases. Please give him chance and seek all of the approaches that you will need to come to wholeness. And God knows the end from the beginning and says that there is more to you. There are greater heights you are yet to see, but they are all waiting for you. Don't let trauma limit you. Don't let trauma dull your shine. A whole new future is out there waiting for you. I invite you to more. Thank you very much for staying with me. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.